Hi, everyone, and welcome. We're so glad you've joined us here today for this very special discussion to honor the life and legacy of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. My name is Jennifer Herrera, and I'm the Vice President of External Affairs for the National Women's History Museum. For the past 25 years, the museum has served as the largest online cultural institution dedicated to U.S. women's history. For far too long, women have been underrepresented, if not largely erased. From public monuments and the halls of Congress to U.S. history textbooks, women's voices, contributions, and accomplishments are often missing. We believe representation matters, and it is urgent. Our mission is to tell a more complete and accurate history because inclusive history is good history. As an early leader in virtual content, the museum has worked to integrate women's contributions into the fabric of our national narrative through pioneering research, innovative and accessible programming, and resources for educators and learners of all ages, including online exhibits, hundreds of biographies, and in-person and virtual public programming and events like this one today. As many of you know, we're honored to have Emma Rothberg on our team as our U.S. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg Pre-Doctoral Fellow in Gender Studies. Emma is a PhD candidate in the History Department at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her research focuses on gender, urban labor, and cultural history in the United States. It is with deep gratitude that we thank all of our charter members and supporters who've helped extend this fellowship through 2024 and who helped underwrite today's program. To further support our work and to become a member of our museum, please visit our website, womenshistory.org. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. We are so delighted to have our phenomenal presenters here today, and we're really grateful that you are spending your afternoon with us today as we honor Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It is now my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Liz Everline.
Thank you, Jen. As Jen mentioned, my name is Liz Everline, and I am the Education Programs Manager at the National Women's History Museum. We thank you for joining us this afternoon for today's Sunday at Home program, honoring the life and legacy of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg 1 year after her passing. Today's discussion and conversation is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the National Women's History Museum's website within the next few days. Our speakers today will be available to take and answer questions, so please use the chat for any comments that you may have and the Q&A function on your screen to submit your questions at any time during the program. Justice, Justice, Thou Shalt Pursue is the result of a period of collaboration between Justice Ginsburg and Amanda L. Tyler. During a visit to UC Berkeley in September 2019, Justice Ginsburg told her life story in conversation with Tyler, and the two brought together that conversation and other materials that shared details from Justice Ginsburg's family life and long career. The passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg in September 2020, as this co-authored book was heading into production, was met with a public outpouring of grief. With her death, the country lost a hero and national treasure whose incredible life and legacy made the United States a more just society, and one in which we, the people, for whom the Constitution is written, includes everyone. Ruth Bader Ginsburg's last book is a curation of her own legacy, tracing the long history of her work for gender equality and a more perfect union. Here with us today to talk about this book and experience working with Justice Ginsburg is Amanda L. Tyler. Amanda L. Tyler is the Shannon Cecil Turner Professor of Law at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. Professor Tyler's research and teaching interests include the Supreme Court, federal courts, constitutional law, legal history, civil procedure, and statutory interpretation. In addition to Justice, Justice, Thou Shalt Pursue, Tyler is also the author of Habeas Corpus in Wartime, From the Tower of London to Guantanamo Bay, published in 2017 by Oxford University Press and released in paperback in 2019. And she has contributed to many books and published with The Atlantic, the Lawfare blog, other media outlets, and numerous law journals. Since 2016, Professor Tyler also has served as a co-editor of Hart and Wexler's The Federal Courts in the Federal System, Foundation Press, with Richard H. Fallon Jr., Jack L. Goldsmith, John F. Manning, and David L. Shapiro. Also with us this afternoon is Melissa Murray. Melissa Murray is the Frederick I and Grace Stokes Professor of Law at NYU School of Law, where she teaches constitutional law, family law, criminal law, and reproductive rights and justice. Her writing has appeared in a range of legal and lay publications, including the Harvard Law Review, the Yale Law Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Nation. Prior to joining the NYU Law faculty, Murray was the Alexander F. and May T. Morrison Professor of Law at the University of California, Berkeley, where she received the law school's Rudder Award for Teaching Distinction, the Association of American Law Schools Derek A. Bell Award, and from March 2016 to June 2017, served as interim dean of the law school. Murray serves as a legal analyst for MSNBC and is a co-host of Strict Scrutiny, a podcast about the Supreme Court and the legal culture that surrounds it. A graduate of the University of Virginia and Yale Law School, Murray clerked for Sonia Sotomayor, then a judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, and Stefan Underhill of the U.S. District Court for the District of Connecticut. She is a member of the American Law Institute and the New York Bar. We are so pleased that both Amanda and Melissa could be here with us today on this occasion, and it is a pleasure to welcome them to the National Women's History Museum Sundays at Home programming. And now I'll turn the program over to them both.
Thank you so much, Liz, for those generous introductions. And thank you so much to the National Women's History Museum for hosting this important conversation on the anniversary of Justice Ginsburg's passing. I am delighted to be here with my former colleagues. It's hard to say former, we still talk to each other on a regular basis, but so delighted to be here with Amanda Tyler, who was Justice Ginsburg's co-author for this last book of her life. The legacy is clear in this book. And so we're going to dive right in. So Amanda, you and Justice Ginsburg obviously had a close working relationship, but it's not every clerk that also gets to be her justice's co-author. So how did you and Justice Ginsburg come to write this book together?
Well, I mean, that is a really important thing to note, is that I had served as Justice Ginsburg's law clerk 20 years ago, and count that as one of the most greatest blessings of my life. I mean, it was such an honor and a privilege and a joy to be her law clerk and to get to know her. And over the years, we kept up. I mean, she takes her law clerks under her wings, and she was a tremendous mentor and a dear friend. And it was always especially fun to welcome her to various law schools where I taught, to see her interact with our students. I think you were at Berkeley for one of her visits when she came. She came a couple of times to Berkeley, and she came most recently in 2019. And the book is an outgrowth of that. She was supposed to come, I should say, in early 2019, but when it was discovered after a fall and a broken rib that she had lung cancer in the winter of 2018, 2019, we had to postpone. And I should note, she did not want to postpone. This is the Justice Ginsburg who I was so fortunate to know. She really wanted to keep the commitment, because the reason for that particular visit to Berkeley was to honor her longtime dear friend and our mutual friend and colleague, Herma Hill-Kay, who I know was a big mentor of yours. Herma had been the second woman law professor on the Berkeley Law faculty, our first woman dean, a great scholar and advocate for women's equality. And together, the two of them had written the very first casebook on gender discrimination and the law, effectively creating or founding this field in the early 1970s. And they remained lifelong friends for 50 years, very good, very close friends. And Herma unfortunately passed away in 2017. So the justice was coming to give the inaugural Herma Hill-Kay Memorial Lecture to honor her late friend. And that's why it was so important to her to come. And I was pleased that she did well in response to her lung cancer surgery and was very quick to reschedule the event to come in the fall of 2019, which she did. And she came, that is. And during that event, we decided, this was really her decision, I should say, that I would interview her about her life. She said she really enjoyed doing what we're doing, being in conversation with a friend, and it's much more natural and free-flowing that way. I had interviewed her before, so we had done this before, and we had a sense of how it would go. And with Justice Ginsburg, I should note, nothing was ever on the fly. So she was always, I like to say, the most prepared person in the room. So we had gone back and forth many, many times over the drafts of what questions I would ask, what we would cover. And along the way, we decided that maybe we could turn this into the book project and use the conversation as sort of an anchor within which we would cover the scope of her life, both personal and professional. And then we would choose highlights from different aspects of her life to complement what we had done. And I can say obviously quite a bit more about what we chose to include, but just a very superficial overview. We include materials from her time as an advocate, fighting for gender equality. We include materials from her time as a justice. And we've included the final speeches that she gave at the end of her life, which are a really special window into, again, both her personal life and her professional life. But the impetus for the book was also connected to Herma, because as you know, because you wrote a passage for the book, Herma had written a book chronicling the stories of the first American women law professors in the United States. And publishers weren't interested in it. And this really bothered Justice Ginsburg because she had written the introduction for the book in 2015. And here we were in 2019 and still no publisher was taking the book. And she really thought it was important that, and I think this speaks to the venue we're at today, that we chronicle and preserve the stories of these early women in the academy that had paved the way for Justice Ginsburg and for Herma to enter the academy. And so she and I, as we were discussing creating a book, we decided to offer it exclusively to the University of California Press. And we said, we would like you to have this book, but we wanted to publish alongside Herma's book. And so very happily, UC Press agreed to this. And I'm very proud to have both books over my shoulder. I know Justice Ginsburg would be so pleased to know that our book published alongside Herma's book and that those stories are preserved. And I really like, and I appreciate you bearing with me for this very long-winded answer, but I really like to tell that story because it's a window into the Justice Ginsburg who I was so fortunate to know. She loved to use her position, and she was very mindful of her position to lift up the voices of others. And I think that's a really special aspect of who she was.
It's a terrific story, and the point of lifting up other women's voices is not lost on me. And also the opportunity that she gave you to collaborate with her on this particular project as well is also not lost on me. Can you tell us a little bit about the title, Justice, Justice, Thou Shalt Pursue? I know this has biblical associations, but can you tell us what it meant to Justice Ginsburg?
So it obviously, it's a passage from Deuteronomy. It's a very important passage. Justice is repeated twice, and there's a real emphasis as people understand the phrase on pursuing justice as one of your core life values. And that certainly, I think, is how many people would describe Justice Ginsburg. What made me think for us to have this in the title was that she had a piece of beautiful artwork in her chambers that had Justice, Justice, Thou Shalt Pursue on it. And so I've often associated her specifically with that passage from the Bible because of it hanging in her office. And choosing a book title is actually very challenging. I've always struggled with it. And one day I thought, oh my gosh, this is so clearly what we should do. And I really like it. I'm really, really proud of it.
It's a great title. You had to go about the process of actually culling from Justice Ginsburg's voluminous writings as an advocate, as a jurist, as a speech giver, all of these different materials that she had to work with to actually curate this collection. So the book is divided up into three parts: Justice Ginsburg's work as an advocate, her work as a judge, and then the speeches that she gave, many of them in the later part of her life. How did you decide on these particular collection of materials?
So it was hard to be very clear. As you say, voluminous doesn't do it justice. She was a judge for 40 years, a federal judge for 40 years. She wrote over 1,000 opinions. Just that part of her life, there's a massive volume there. But there were a few guiding principles for us as we talked about this. And I have to say, it was so much fun to get to work with her on this. Just such a treat to have conversations with her about her time as an advocate. Okay, what were your favorite cases? So that was partly a guiding principle. Same on the court in terms of choosing the opinions. What were your favorite opinions? And then I would, in those conversations, I would say, oh, but boss, I called her boss or justice. I would say, boss, what about this one? This is a really good opinion. And she'd say, nah, it's not one of the 4 or 5 favorites. So she had a very fixed idea of what she wanted to be included. We also were trying to take things that tethered back to our conversation, which really is the anchor of the book, because there she walks people through her life. And so, for example, we included the brief from the very first gender discrimination case that she litigated. It's never been published before. It's a case called Moritz. It's the case that is featured in the movie On the Basis of Sex. If people have seen that movie, her nephew actually wrote that movie. And he said he chose to write it about that case because it was as much about her marriage to Marty as it was about her advocacy career. And I think that was true for her as well. It's what made her feel so fondly about the case. It wasn't just that it launched this incredible sea change litigation career in the 1970s. It was that she litigated that first case with her spouse and her life partner and her great love. And that brief had never been published before, so we definitely wanted to include that. But then, it really just became, like I said, this back and forth. And we also didn't want to replicate her other book. And I should, for those who are huge RBG aficionados, there's another book as well called My Own Words that she published some years ago with her 2 authorized biographers. And it is quite extensive. It includes a huge amount of materials. We made a decision that we didn't want to replicate. We wanted to complement that book. And we also wanted to create a book that was more accessible to people who really just wanted to hit the highlights as she saw them of her legacy.
So Amanda, Marilyn Gleistein is asking you to hold up a copy of the book, if you would, so we can all get a glimpse of it. Would you mind?
Yeah.
Thank you, Marilyn. We're not doing a good job of selling the book. Here it is. Buy the book. It's amazing. My dog loves this book. I read it. I read it to my puppy when I got my new puppy. But it is an amazing book that gives, I think, a strong sense of the trajectory of her life through these professional writings. And you get a sense of who she was as a litigator and as an advocate. She was the woman who basically wrote women into the Constitution. Nowhere in the Constitution, except for the 19th Amendment, are women specifically mentioned, but she got the court to actually read women into its interpretation of the 14th Amendment. And that Moritz case, as you say, is the beginning of it, but it's not the end. And she spent a long time during her work for the Women's Rights Project of the ACLU litigating that. And then she had this terrific career as a judge. She was nominated to the bench first by Jimmy Carter in that 1970s push to diversify the federal judiciary. She went to the DC Circuit and then later was elevated to the Supreme Court by Bill Clinton in 1993. Why did you select the cases that she decided as a judge? Because they're very specific, the ones you picked. Which ones did you pick and why did you pick those?
So I want to emphasize she picked them.
Okay.
And she was very clear. These were her 4 favorite opinions of all the opinions she had written in 40 years and in 27 years on the Supreme Court. And I think each one has a different story behind it. The first is VMI. VMI is really just a capstone moment for her, switching from advocate to judge. She, as you said, in the 1970s was a force to be reckoned with at the Supreme Court, taking a court that in the early 1960s held in a case called Hoyt versus Florida that women belong in the home. It's okay for states to exclude women from jury roles because their primary function is to take care of the home and family. 10 years later, she's arguing to the court that the Equal Protection Clause needs to include women. And I should give a shout out here to Pauline Murray, who was a huge influence on Justice Ginsburg. And there's a new documentary out about her. She also has Berkeley law ties. So we're very proud of that. She was pushing this even earlier, and Justice Ginsburg gives her credit, gives her and Dorothy Kenyon credit on the first brief she files with the Supreme Court, lists them as co-authors, even though they hadn't actually worked on the case. But another example of her lifting up other women's voices. And I think that's a really important theme. Then she gets to the Supreme Court, and after winning all these victories in the 1970s, in which the Supreme Court acknowledges that there should be heightened scrutiny of any classification based on gender in the law, she gets a case in front of the court just 3 years into her tenure that involves the Virginia Military Institute that wants to continue to exclude female cadets. And the state of Virginia proposes creating this secondary, really not even close to equal military
It's the
school.
Virginia Women's Institute for Leadership at Marian College.
Yes.
This was litigated when I was an undergraduate.
So, and as you well know, what was proposed was going to be nothing even remotely similar to VMI, which is a very storied, well-endowed, amazing facilities institution with a huge alumni network. So in that case, the Supreme Court decides VMI has to open its doors to women. And that case was really special to her for a lot of reasons that are obvious and some that are not so obvious. So the obvious, she gets to write for the court now, striking down opportunities that are being denied to women, and she gets to propel and open up those opportunities. This is what her life's work had been about. She gets to cite all the victories she had won in the 1970s along the way. So that's the obvious. But the other reason why VMI was so special to her, there are two. One is that originally the case was assigned to Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman on the Supreme Court. And Justice O'Connor said, no, Justice Ginsburg should write this opinion. And Justice Ginsburg felt real kinship with Justice O'Connor. She referred to her even, a year ago in conversation to me, she referred to her as a big sister. And so that was a really special gesture, I think, for Justice O'Connor to say, no, based on her work, Justice Ginsburg should write this. And then the final reason why that case was so special to her is that it was the bookend to a case she had litigated and lost in the 1970s called Vorchheimer. And that case involved a challenge to single-sex, high-achieving student high schools in Philadelphia. And of course, the girls' high school was inferior in every respect to the boys' high school. And so some girls sued and they said, we want to go to the boys' high school because they have better facilities and more science and math classes, etc. And the case wound up in the Supreme Court. It's a very long story, but the short version is Justice Ginsburg wrote the opening brief, and then the original lawyer on the case sort of pushed her out and wrote the reply and did the argument. And I can tell you as recently as 2020, Justice Ginsburg was telling me she was still angry about that. She really wanted to argue and see that case through. And the Supreme Court wound up dividing 4-4 in that case, which meant the lower court decision was affirmed and the lower court had upheld the separate high schools. So VMI, 20 years later, allows Justice Ginsburg, in the case, the formal case is called United States versus Virginia, allows her for the Supreme Court to write an opinion effectively saying Vorchheimer is now bad law. And she was so happy about that. Now, the other three decisions she included in the book are all dissents. And that too tells us a lot about where her mind was in 2020 and how she thought about her role on the Supreme Court. And unfortunately, they were dissents. I'm sure she would have preferred to include those same opinions and have them be opinions that spoke for the court. But what happened, as we know, is she became this great dissenter. And unfortunately, she became a voice for all of those who thought that who thought that the court was either not making enough progress or in some cases actually walking back progress and gains that had been made. So those dissents include, particularly to this last point, her Voting Rights Act dissent in the case of Shelby County. And there, the Supreme Court struck down the pre-clearance requirements of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which had been reaffirmed by Congress more recently, and was a critical, as she says, arguably one of the most, if not the most important pieces of civil rights legislation in American history. And the majority guts it by holding that the preclearance requirements can no longer be sustained, and holds that they're unconstitutional. She writes just a vigorous dissent. I mean, just a tour de force. And she was very proud of that dissent. And she wanted people, I think, to continue to be vigilant about voting rights. She understood how important that issue was. And we obviously can talk more about this. You're an expert on this as well, Melissa. The other dissents are Ledbetter and Hobby Lobby. They're both gender cases and reproductive rights. In the latter case, Hobby Lobby, a reproductive rights case. She cared passionately about the continuing advancement of gender equality in this country. And she also cared passionately about women having reproductive freedom, because she believed that that was integral to true gender equality. So I think she included all those dissents, sort of as a reminder to all of us that there's still a lot of work to be done. And, this is someone who was at the end of her life, and she knew she wasn't going to be around much longer. And in fact, she knew that her days were very numbered by the time we were finishing everything with the book. And I think in some respects, she left us a roadmap for work to continue.
So Amanda, your last remarks, I think, are leading me in a different direction than I thought I would. I thought we'd talk a little bit more about the book, and we can get back to the book. But what you just said, I think it's worth just acknowledging that we are a year from her passing, and the landscape at the court looks markedly different than it did a year ago. I think a year ago, we were anticipating the prospect of the first African-American woman to be nominated to the court. Joe Biden, as a presidential candidate, had made that pledge. And I think we had anticipated that Justice Ginsburg would survive the presidential election and would speedily step down to make way for that first Biden appointee. And that's obviously not what happened. Leaving aside the question of the whole process of nominating her successor, which was incredibly quick, the court is in a very different posture than it was when Justice Ginsburg was on the court. She was the anchor of a 5-4 majority where the liberals were in the minority, and she was the anchor of that liberal minority. But there seemed to be more play in the joints, and occasionally they could get the Chief Justice to join them on certain issues. Sometimes Justice Gorsuch would join them. Now the court is a solid 6-3 conservative supermajority. We have seen in just the last few weeks reproductive rights decimated in Texas, one of the most populous states in the union. The court is poised to take up another case on the abortion right in this new term that's coming up, and will start on the first Monday of October. What would Justice Ginsburg have made of these developments, reproductive rights, to voting rights, and just the state of the court right now?
I think she would be very troubled by some of the things that are happening. If you take just the procedural posture of the recent Texas case, you have, as you said, the court has a pending merits case before it involving abortion. And notwithstanding the fact that they are receiving full briefing and will have full argument in that case, which does pose a very serious challenge to Roe versus Wade. And Melissa, you're the expert. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. But despite the fact that that case is pending, you have a law in Texas that is written to directly confront and undermine existing Supreme Court precedent that has been in place for almost 50 years. I mean, Roe versus Wade, we're almost 50 years out now. And this law says no abortions after 6 weeks, which is just directly in contravention of Roe and Casey from, what is that, 20, my math's not my strong suit, 30 years ago?
Why we went to law school.
They said there would be no math, exactly. So this law is in direct contravention of two longstanding and constantly reaffirmed Supreme Court precedents, and yet the Supreme Court allows it to go into effect while it has a pending case before it. The court would never have done this, and certainly wouldn't do it in any other context. It's madness, really, to allow that, just on that procedural issue, never mind the merits, to allow, while you have a pending case, allow a law to go into effect that is in direct violation of existing precedent. She would have been up in arms about that. She most certainly would have been with the dissenters there. And notice, the Chief Justice was with the dissenters, which I think tells you that institutionally, some of the things that are happening right now are really unprecedented. And so I think she would be quite concerned about that. I think she was already obviously a dissenter so often in so many prominent cases in the later years of her tenure on the court. She would be, I think, even more displeased, to understate it significantly, with the state of the court right now.
I think that was my intuition as well. I mean, as you say, not only was she a stalwart champion of women's rights, she was actually an expert in civil procedure. So I think this would have rankled on a number of dimensions, not the least of which just the procedural aspect of it. Okay, back to the book then, because I really do want to get back into the book and how you made some of these selections. Many of the opinions that you selected, as you say, are dissents. She was famous for wearing her dissent collar on days when she dissented, but she really only became a vocal dissenter on the court later in her career. And I'll note, I believe it was when she was among the justices, the only woman. So I think her first public dissent from the bench was, I believe, in Ledbetter. And it was at a time when Justice O'Connor had retired from the court. And it was in that sort of interregnum period where Justice Ginsburg was the only woman. And she came to NYU to give a speech, and she remarked the time was like being the only woman in this bevy of what she called very well-fed men. And it was very funny. What do you think that experience of being the only woman on the court was like for her? And how did her earlier experience of gender discrimination in the workplace, do you think, inform her time there and what she wrote during that interregnum period?
Well, I can say two things. The first is just, and I'm sure you've had this experience as well, just from my own life experience, finding myself in situations as the only woman in the room. It's a very alienating, very difficult thing to have. Second, though, she and I actually talked about this, and she really was very unhappy during those years. I remember multiple conversations where she said, it's just, I can't believe, after all that I have spent my life's work fighting for, I'm the only woman on this court right now. And it was incredibly frustrating for her in cases like Ledbetter. In other cases, there was an abortion case during those years where the majority opinion talks about women's emotions and how they may come to regret having an abortion. And she writes a dissent in which she says, come on, that's so paternalistic. And no woman would ever say that about another woman. Now, maybe that she didn't say that, and maybe people might contest that. But her point was, you're really missing the perspective of a woman when you write things like that. And in Ledbetter, that case involved the question whether, when someone is underpaid because of their gender time and time again, and it becomes, at least in practical reality, cumulative, can that person sue under the workplace discrimination laws, specifically Title VII, to collect damages for all of the underpayments based on gender, going back years and years? And the majority, in an opinion by Justice Alito, says no. And here, really, you do see her life and background come to the fore, both in terms of gender, but also in terms of having grown up humbly. She talks about the workplace, and she says, first of all, you guys don't even understand what it's like to be, in the blue collar workplace. And secondly, you certainly don't understand what it's like to be the only woman. And there's real irony in that she's pointing this out while she is the only woman on the Supreme Court. And she highlights, for example, that if you're the only woman like Lilly Ledbetter was in her position in a Goodyear factory, and you think you might be the subject of discrimination, you're not going to cry out about it right away, because you don't want to be looked at as a troublemaker. You want to make absolutely sure. And that's exactly what Ledbetter did. And that's what every woman would have done in that situation, as she points out. And that's why particularly when you're interpreting a statute that Congress intended to sweep extremely broadly to fight discrimination, you should interpret the statute consistently with the practical realities of the real world. And nonetheless, that was a 5-4, and she was shockingly on the losing end of that. But Congress, per her prodding, in the last line of her dissent, she says, you know, we're just talking about a statute. So the ball's in Congress's court. It can fix the error of my colleagues' ways. And right away, Congress takes up the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, and it was one of the first laws that President Obama signed into effect when he became president. So that was a situation where I think it was a dissent, but it was also in the long term a victory, not for Lilly Ledbetter, but for the women who would sue after that.
And again, I think she was not only channeling just being the only woman in the room, but just sort of being a woman in the workplace more generally. I mean, she had a tremendous experience of gender discrimination as a young lawyer. She graduated from Columbia Law School. She'd initially matriculated at Harvard, but then transferred to Columbia when her husband, Marty, who is a very famous tax lawyer, got a job in New York City. But she was at the top of her class at Columbia, and it was typical for the person at the top of the class to then go off to clerk for a prominent federal judge and then on to the Supreme Court. And Felix Frankfurter, who was one of the justices who likely would have been interested in her, would not take her. And in fact, no federal judges would take her until her professor, Gerald Gunther, told them that he would not recommend another Columbia student to them for a clerkship if they did not take a chance on Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And he promised them if she didn't work out or if she got pregnant, he'd get them another clerk, but they had to take the chance on her. And Edmund Palmieri of the Southern District of New York was the one who ultimately took the chance on her. But I mean, again, she is the top of her class. And Justice O'Connor has a very similar story as well, graduating at the top of her class from Stanford Law School and being unable to find any kind of legal work except as a legal secretary, which then propels her into public interest work, which then leads to her career in the Arizona Senate. But these experiences are unlike anything anyone on the court has experienced. Like as she notes, none of the other members of the court have had blue collar jobs. They're not women. They don't know what this is like. Given that, to what extent do you think that representation matters in a body like the Supreme Court, which by its very nature is already not representative of the democracy because these are individuals who are not accountable to the public through the political process? Why does it matter whether the court is or is not representative of the country as a whole?
I think the Ledbetter opinion is one of several I would cite that explain why it is so important. And I'm sure you can add to this. One opinion that comes to mind is one written by your judge, Justice Sotomayor, in the Streif case, where she writes about what it's like to be a person of color and to be the subject of police harassment, surveillance, whatever you want to call it. And I think that these perspectives are so important because these issues that trickle up to the Supreme Court, on the one hand, when you're there and you and I teach constitutional law, you teach these cases, they seem general and abstract in some respects. But the reality is, and I think this was something that was really special about Justice Ginsburg's perspective, and I see it also in Justice Sotomayor's jurisprudence, there's a huge appreciation for how these issues trickle down, trickle down and really impact the lived experiences of real Americans. And so if you don't have people on the high court who have a window into what those worlds are like, and who don't also have a willingness to try and understand what the experiences are of a broad spectrum of American society, then you're going to have a real problem because these decisions really will be abstract. They will not be connected to the real world in a way that is so important and I think was so central to a lot of Justice Ginsburg's jurisprudence.
I will note her last opinion for the court was a dissent in a case involving the contraceptive mandate and accommodations for the contraceptive mandate under the Affordable Care Act. And so it's a reproductive rights case. And she noted specifically the millions of American women who are gainfully employed, have health insurance through their employer, but are nonetheless prohibited from getting this kind of reproductive care because their employer may object and may seek to avoid compliance with the terms of the Affordable Care Act's mandate. And she put it in very concrete terms about these working women who basically are losing out on some of the benefits of their employment. So she was always very quick, I think, to ground things in the actual people. Let's talk a little bit about some of her heroes. And these are reflected, I think, in some of the selections that you made toward the end of the book and the speeches that you culled. One of the speeches you selected is very revealing. It's a reflection on Justice Louis Brandeis, who was the first Jewish American to sit on the Supreme Court. He was also the creator of what was called the Brandeis Brief, which was a collection of social science statistics about a particular topic. And the very first Brandeis Brief was deployed in a case called Mueller versus Oregon. There, the United States Supreme Court upheld an Oregon law that prescribed minimum working hours for women, or maximum working hours, excuse me, for women on the ground that such laws were necessary to protect women as the mothers of the next generation. This seems like exactly the sort of thing that Justice Ginsburg would have hated, yet she very much admired Justice Brandeis. So can you explain what she found so intriguing about Brandeis and how she managed to reconcile this aspect of his advocacy with his legacy?
Well, there were a few things about Justice Brandeis that I think she particularly found helpful to her when she was a lawyer, practicing lawyer and advocate in the 1970s. And so for her, she was really sort of cherry picking his strategic choices and the different approaches that he took for her own ends, even though she very strongly disagreed with his ends in cases like Mueller, which were, paternalistic, to put it mildly. And so nonetheless, she saw how successful his tactics were. And so she borrowed many of them. And two in particular were to copy this brief to give the court concrete information, going back to what I was saying before, about how its decisions trickle down and really affect people on the ground, working women in particular. So he had done it for his own ends. She did it to tell a different story and to tell a whole series of stories to the court in the 1970s. And stories, if I can sort of digress for a minute, stories that really played up how laws that maybe were well-meaning, laws to protect women, actually held women and men back, actually discriminated in lots of different ways that might not have been predicted. And so that was, I think, a really important tactic for her to employ in the 1970s, because, also to your last question, who's she in front of at the Supreme Court? 9 men. There are no women on the Supreme Court until O'Connor in '81. And so her whole audience, this whole decade, it's all men. There are very few women on the federal courts at all until, as you noted at the outset, Jimmy Carter puts some women on the courts. I mean, there were literally a handful before that. So she was trying to use the tactic of explaining how this discrimination runs in a lot of different directions. And I think that was inspired in part by Brandeis. Another one of his tactics that she liked is that he would, as a justice, he liked to see remedies level up. And so when she had clients like, for example, a man who was being denied Social Security benefits when he wants to stay home with his baby, that's the Weisenfeld case. If he'd been a woman, he would have gotten the benefits. She argues that this discrimination, this classification based on gender, violates equal protection. And she goes on to argue the remedy should be that he gets the benefits, not that the benefits are taken away from women so that we level down. And that was a Brandeis-inspired approach that she was very successful employing in the 1970s. So I think it's that. I think it's also that he was, a Jewish justice. So there are a lot of different ways that they were connected and that she looked up to him. But she also was, she was brilliant in the sense that she could study someone and see what she could take out and use and employ to her own ends.
So the two other speeches that are collected in this part of the book, one is a set of remarks given at the Genesis Foundation where she pays tribute to great Jewish Americans, including Emma Lazarus, who is the poet whose poem, The New Colossus, is what's inscribed on the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. And then the second one is the final speech that she made at a naturalization ceremony for new citizens. And I can't help but imagine that the inclusion of these materials is intended as a nod to the importance of her faith in her life, although she wasn't overly observant in any way. I mean, I don't think she considered herself strictly observant, but she really did relish in her Jewish heritage, and she very much appreciated being the daughter of immigrants. She noted that she was a first generation American on one side and a second generation American on the other. Can you say a little bit of both about her faith and about this idea of being a new American in some degree?
I think that she was very proud to be Jewish. She was very proud of the fact that this country had given refuge to her family as they were fleeing persecution in Europe. And she was very proud to be the daughter and granddaughter, just barely, she would say, of immigrants. I think her mother was born here just days after the family immigrated. And the inclusion of these speeches was conscious in the sense of playing up that part of her identity, but it was also, I mean, this is what she was talking about and thinking about at the end of her life. These were the contents of the last speeches. And I think that too tells you, where she was in terms of her mindset at the end of her life. I think in particular, the last speech, which is so beautiful. I've read it 100 times and I still get emotional when I read it, and even more so when I listen to it. She is really giving us a window into what makes her tick. And I think a big part of it that I hope people understand about her is how deeply she loved this country and how proud she was to be a public servant. And that's why I think she loved being on the Supreme Court. It's partly why she didn't want to leave. She truly loved this country and she wanted to do everything she could to use her talents to give back. Because, as she says in that speech, this country opened its arms to her family during a crucial time. And it made all the difference. And she was also just so proud that it was possible to be the child of immigrants and to go in one generation from being a bookkeeper's daughter to a Supreme Court justice. And that also, I think, is something that she thought was really special about this country. So, the speeches were just, I think they're really a treasure trove in the book. And I'm so glad that we included them.
I think they are amazing. And I'm feeling slightly verklempt now that you're talking about the whole idea of like from one generation. I think that is the story of immigrants in this country. And it's a powerful one. And she powerfully represents that. The other thing she powerfully represents is the fusion of Supreme Court culture, which is not often interjected with pop culture, but she managed to bridge the distance between the Supreme Court and Us Weekly when she became the Notorious RBG. So the Notorious RBG results from a meme that was created by law students, one of whom was a student here at NYU, in the wake of Justice Ginsburg's iconic dissent in Shelby County versus Holder, which was that voting rights case that Amanda earlier mentioned. And being compared to the rapper, the Notorious RBG might have struck some justices as an inopportune comparison, but she really relished the comparison. So can you say a little bit more about what it was like when your boss became notorious?
We, as clerks, we divide ourselves into the pre-notorious group and the post-notorious group. And those of us in the pre-notorious group, that's code for we're older, we were floored by this. She is the last person we would have ever expected to blow up and have her face printed on tote bags and have bobbleheads. And, I'm seeing now masks with her on it. Just never in a million years would I have expected that. She was brilliant, just an incredible role model, a personal hero, even before I clerked for her, based on her work in the 1970s. All of these extraordinary things that now everybody knows about her, we knew, and we were all so thrilled to work for her because of that. But she was also quiet and a little bit reserved and shy, and she spoke slowly, and you would not have thought that this would then morph into this. And boy, did it morph, because I can tell you, there's a book that my kids read a few years back called Wonder. Maybe your kids have read it as well. It's a wonderful book. There's a line at the end of the book where Augie, the lead character, says, everyone in their life just should experience a standing ovation. And I have to tell you, I thought about that line when she and I walked on the stage at UC Berkeley in 2019. The standing ovation was so raucous and so unbelievable for her. And of course it was for her. Let me be very clear. I was acutely aware it was for her, but it literally took my breath away. I couldn't believe it, that just the energy and the joy and the excitement about her being there. And it was so awesome. And I noticed then, and on many other occasions, she had a tote bag with her notes, and it had "I dissent." Ruth Bader Ginsburg makes her mark on it, and she made a point of setting it down so it was facing the audience. And I think that tells you that she just decided, okay, if people are going to do this, I'm going to run with it. And I think she came to see some of the good in it. And I certainly have, insofar as I think it's great that there are children's books called "I Dissent" that have young kids reading about an octogenarian female role model. That's awesome. That are learning that if you see injustice or something that's wrong, you should speak up, even if it's not necessarily the popular position. And that are learning, to be ambitious and aim for the stars. And I think that is partly what she saw was happening with Notorious RBG, insofar as I remember walking through her office shortly after she passed and looking and studying the pictures on her desk. She had a lot of pictures of her standing with little girls dressed up in Supreme Court robes. And so that is a really special thing, that little girls were looking up to her and seeing, I can be on the Supreme Court and I can speak up and I can do all of these things. And I think that's incredible. And I think she came to really like that about it.
So I think she did really relish it, certainly in the later part of her life. I'll also note, though, that it is a move that I think other justices have tried to make. Like, so Justice Scalia, I think, became very much an icon on the right for the conservative legal movement because of the opinions that he wrote. He never had tote bags, he never had t-shirts, never had a meme. But he did sort of generate within the sort of closed cluster of the conservative legal movement the same kind of energy. And that energy really did then get fueled into law schools where young lawyers were then sort of steeped in his views. And I wonder if part of the appeal of all of this for her was not simply in sort of the broad appeal to the public, but that she could be that kind of iconic figure on the left for young women and men in law schools, and to sort of seed a whole generation of young lawyers who were vested in a more progressive or liberal vision of constitutional interpretation.
I think that's certainly part of it, because she disagreed with Justice Scalia on just about everything, even though they were friends, as many people know. But I certainly think, she had been a law professor like you and me. She had been in this world, and she understood how powerful his influence was. And so I think certainly part of the benefit to her was to go around to these law schools and talk about a different way, as you say, to think about the Constitution, and a different way to think about the law. I think that she viewed the law as a vehicle for opening up opportunities, for expansive inclusion of people. She celebrated time and again, including in her VMI opinion, but in her speeches elsewhere, the greatness of America is in its ability to become ever more inclusive, that the Constitution is evolving and the definition of who we the people are is expanding constantly. That was one thing. And then, in that final speech in the book, she quotes de Tocqueville, who says that what makes America great is that it can look at its faults and study them and try to do better. And I think that is the way that she thought about the Constitution. And it's a very different vision than what Justice Scalia was, teaching that the Constitution should mean what it meant in 1789. That's just a completely different way of thinking about things.
That is certainly the case. So we are now in the part of the program where we would be delighted to take questions from the audience. So if you've not already had the opportunity to do so, please log your questions in the Q&A function. We're going to go through them. I'm going to start with Andrea Estepa's question, which is about Justice Ginsburg and her relationship with Pauli Murray. Did they have a kind of personal relationship? Patricia Bell has written a terrific book called The First Lady and the Firebrand, which is about Pauli Murray's relationship with First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. But did Justice Ginsburg actually know Pauli Murray?
Yes, they did. They worked together through the ACLU. And so I think that's how she came to really appreciate what Pauli Murray was writing about, was promoting and pushing in terms of thinking about equality, not just along racial lines, but also along gender lines. And she really took a lot of that and ran with it. And I think that's a big reason why she wanted to credit Pauli Murray in her first brief to the Supreme Court in Reed versus Reed, when she included her as co-counsel. I also know Pauli Murray mooted her on occasion for, I think it was the Moritz case, helped prepare her for that argument. And so, yes, they had worked together, and I've seen correspondence between them from that period. So I think she really admired and looked up to Pauli Murray. And I'm really pleased to see that Pauli Murray is now getting so much attention and credit, because she's extraordinary. And all of what she was saying and promoting, she was, I don't want to use the term ahead of her time, because I think really we were late to catch up as a country to where we were supposed to be, but she was ahead of her time in terms of promoting where we need to go and how to get there. And so the justice thought of her as a very important influence.
And for those of you who have seen the documentary RBG by Julie Cohen and Betsy West, Cohen and West have actually put out another documentary. This one is called My Name is Pauli Murray, and it is about the life of Pauli Murray. And it was a splash at Sundance last year, and it's absolutely fabulous. So I recommend that highly as well. Amy Walker has a couple of questions about your time clerking for Justice Ginsburg. So one, what was the most surprising thing about working with her as her clerk? And what was the biggest challenge that the two of you faced in writing the book?
What was so surprising about clerking for her, that she was this real human being. I had read about her work in the 1970s. I had read VMI. It came down while I was in law school. And I just looked up to her. She was a personal hero, but she was a real human being too. And that was really cool to get to work closely with her and get to know her and have so many then and in the years after, so many extraordinary experiences with her. Working for her was challenging because she didn't get where she got through the hurdles she had to go through. Melissa, you were talking about how hard it was just to get a job. She always had to be that much better to get where she got. And how did she do that? By having the most incredible work ethic of any person I have ever met. And that's saying a lot. And so working for her, you had to bring on your A game. You had to work that much harder. The attention to detail, the care with words that she took in her writing was extraordinary. And so when you turned in a draft, you had to think through that and really go over it 100 times before you turned it in. And then it would come back completely marked up, and you would go back and forth 20, 30 times on an opinion before you would finally get it back saying just right. And in the meantime, she would sit down with you and she would go line by line and explain to you why she was making the changes she was making. So she was always teaching. She was always mentoring, and she was always sort of lifting you up and bringing you along with her. And that was extraordinary. I can't emphasize enough how special that made and helpful that made the clerkship experience to my own development, and to think about how I mentor and carry along my students. I'm constantly thinking about her example. The other thing, though, that I would say about the clerkship is it was just, I'll come back to another part of it, but a lot of it was really fun. So she took us to the opera in the middle of the day, and she loved opera, as everybody knows. She took us to see Tosca, and it was really important to her that we fully appreciate the experience. So I remember she called us into her office the day before, and she told us the whole story, and then she got up and she started acting out Tosca, crawling along the stage at the end of the opera. And she's just morphed into this other human being. You know, I said she was quiet and reserved, not when she talked about opera. And so we got to have that experience and then go to the opera with her in the middle of the day. And I went other times with her, and she loved it so much. That was really special. The other thing I would say about the clerkship is that it was the first of many times when she inspired me by just how resilient and incredible she was, and strong. Because that year, 1999, right after I started, she was diagnosed with colorectal cancer. And so that was the first bout with cancer. And she had major surgery and begun extensive treatments for the cancer in the weeks leading up to the start of the term, the first Monday in October, when the first arguments are had. And it was like a week before that. Excuse me, my puppy.
It's Taz, the mini Bernedoodle.
Taz is trying to make an appearance here. I'm sorry. It was about a week before arguments that she had her surgery. And no one thought she would be on the bench for the first day of argument. I certainly didn't. And I remember going into chambers early, and she called from the car and said, "Amanda, call the chief and tell him I'm going to be there." And that was Justice Ginsburg. No matter what, she was always going to go the extra mile. And it goes back to how devoted she was to the job and to being a public servant, and just how incredibly resilient she was. And that carried her through those final couple of years of her life, where she was just trying so hard to keep serving and keep being there. On the book, now I've forgotten what the question was about the book. I'm sorry, I talked so long.
What was the most challenging thing about writing the book? What was the biggest challenge the two of you faced in writing the book?
The biggest challenge, I think, was deciding on the few things to include, because it really...
I should also ask, how did Justice Ginsburg like Taz? Because I know they met.
Yes, I'm very sorry to everyone in the audience. I have a Bernedoodle who's very loud. And he did meet Justice Ginsburg when she came to the House in 2019. And it was very funny because I didn't think she would want to meet him. And I said, "Oh, I'll keep him away, keep him away." And she said, "No, I want to meet the puppy." So she got to meet the puppy, and I had trained him daily, meticulously, to shake her hand. And I think even Taz knew he was in the presence of greatness, because he had it down and he froze. He absolutely froze. So going back to the book, I think what was really challenging was culling the materials, because, as I said, we didn't want to do a deep dive or deep dump of too much. We wanted to create a book that would be accessible to non-lawyers, to people who really wanted to read the highlights, as she saw them, of her career. And so that was really important, to try and not include too much. I mean, the book is long and it includes a lot, but we didn't want to overfill it. We wanted people to really enjoy it and to read it all. So that was the biggest challenge. And then the other thing I will say, connecting back to talking about clerking for her, is that she remained as meticulous and as detail-oriented as ever, because I sent her drafts and they would come back again covered in a sea of ink, just like when I clerked for her, which is really embarrassing, because you would think 20 years after the fact, I would be a little further along in my writing. But, it is what it is. The book's better because of the portions I wrote, she edited. And the other thing I will say, just to go ahead and fall on my sword here and embarrass myself further, is that she was in the hospital for some of the exchanges that we had. And so her assistants would print out my cover emails and then print out the drafts. And I would get back I will highlight here that she was asking for work while in the hospital last summer, which is exactly what she did when she clerked for me. And also that I would get back the drafts all marked up, and not just the drafts, she would mark up my emails, my cover emails, and highlight mistakes in them. So this is how she was still so attended, attending to detail, and she just never missed a beat. And I just, right to the end, was and remain in awe of her.
I should note for the audience, her work ethic was absolutely legendary. And even in the last term of the court, in the last year of her life, when the court, because of the pandemic, was hearing oral arguments through live audio but weren't in person, she actually attended argument and participated in argument from her hospital bed at Johns Hopkins. So again, an absolutely indefatigable work ethic. Okay. Here's a question more about the internal dynamics on the court. I mean, obviously, during her time in the last part of her career on the court, she was very much a part of a 4-person minority with a 5-person majority that was actually making quite strident moves to roll back some of the gains of the civil rights era. Do you think she ever had conversations with her colleagues on the other side about the practical impact of some of those decisions? Like, could you imagine her speaking to the Chief Justice about what would happen on the ground, which we actually saw happen in this electoral cycle down in some of those southern states, but the practical impact of a decision like Shelby County?
I don't know whether she would have, for example, take Shelby County, walk down the halls to the chief and said, you can't do this, you need to understand what's going to happen. I think she, from my own experience, my year at the court with her, she tended to do that through her writing. And so what would happen is that, for those who don't know the inner workings of the Supreme Court, the majority opinion will typically come around, and then some people will sign on to it. This, at least 20 years ago, everything happened in paper, probably not now, certainly post-COVID. But she would then write her dissent and circulate that and try and collect votes. And I think that she typically did that. She tried to convince people through writing, through the written word, and developing in detail and in depth the arguments. And I think that's one of the reasons why, for example, in that case, where she felt so passionately the court was going backward, the dissent is long. It is, exceptionally well supported with facts on the ground and explaining what the ramifications will be, indeed predicting precisely what the ramifications will be. And we're seeing this play out, as you say, in so many states, including Georgia, states that would not have been able to put these laws into effect under the old preclearance regime. They would have had to go through preclearance, and they would have failed in most respects. So, but I think that's really how she did it. Now, that being said, I'm reminded by the question of an example of another case where she did kind of do something like what is being asked, which is to say there was a case called Redding. And you and I have talked about this case. It involved a teenage girl, I think she was 13, maybe, who was strip searched at school. And this is another one of the cases that came to court while Justice Ginsburg was the only woman on the court. And she really was not happy with how it sounded like things were going in that case. And so she actually gave some public interviews where she talked about what it's like to be a teenage girl and in a locker room, and coming in, your body's developing and all of these things, and how difficult it would be to be strip searched at that age. And I think that was her way of very prominently saying to her colleagues, you need to understand, you need to sort of wrap your heads around, maybe go talk to your daughters or your wives about what it's like to be a teenage girl, because you don't seem to get it. And so that is one example where I think she went beyond the written word to try and influence the thinking of her colleagues.
So the name of the book is Justice, Justice, Thou Shalt Pursue, by the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Amanda L. Tyler. We're still here in conversation with Amanda. Amanda, where do you think Justice Ginsburg got this tremendous confidence in her own abilities? What was the secret of her success? Was it this extraordinary and extraordinarily unorthodox marriage for the time to Marty Ginsburg? Was it her family? What shaped her and made her this confident icon?
I'm sure she would say it started with her family. She talked often about how her mother would take her to the library. Her parents very strongly encouraged her to read and to work hard at school. I think certainly she had mean, let's be honest, she was brilliant and she had extraordinary gifts. But then she also had, as she left home, the nurturing of great teachers. She had several teachers she credited at Cornell. She studied under Nabokov. That's how she came to love writing and take such care with her writing. She had a Professor Cushman who taught her about the Constitution and inspired her to think big about how she could make a contribution. And this is during the McCarthy era, and he was pointing out what lawyers were doing, and she credits that as inspiring her to think about a career in the law. And then I think a very big component to it, beyond her talent, beyond mentors, beyond the work ethic. And you mentioned another mentor, Professor Gunther at Columbia, who went to the mats for her, was absolutely Marty. Marty was brilliant and extremely successful in his own right, but he was her biggest booster, as she told me in the conversation that's in the book. He was always the first person in her corner, pushing her and encouraging her to reach for the stars. He was of the mind that they should go to graduate school together and that they would choose the same profession. She talks about this in the book, that they decided against medical school because Marty was on the golf team and golf practice conflicted with the labs. She was happy about that because she didn't think she would have made a good doctor. And then they thought about business school, but Marty was fixated, she said, on going to Harvard, and Harvard Business School did not admit women. So that was off. And so then they decided they would go to Harvard Law School. But just like that, they decided they would go to Harvard Law School. I love this story. It's so hard to get in, but they were both brilliant. And they had great records at Cornell, and they both got in, and they went to Harvard Law School. And then one, opening after another, he encouraged her to reach for the stars. Fast forward to when she is being kicked around as a possible nominee to the Supreme Court. Marty Ginsburg is, a lot of people say, the reason she wound up on the Supreme Court, because he got people together and lobbied for her and really promoted her as a candidate for the court. And that pushed her over the finish line with President Clinton. And that's a big part of the story of how she winds up on the court. And, as I said earlier, they litigated that first case together. So it was really a great marriage of people who deeply and profoundly respected each other, but also were deeply in love. And it was a huge privilege as a law clerk to get to watch that unfold in front of you. Because I think back, as I mentioned, she had cancer the year I clerked for her. And in the early months, it was really scary because it was quite serious. And Marty would come and he would sit in her office and say, "It's time to go home." She would keep working and he'd say, no, it's time to go home. And he was a great chef, as many people may know, and he would prepare the most extraordinary meals for her that she could eat. She had colon surgery. She was in treatment for cancer. You can't eat a lot of different things during that. So he would cultivate these very special meals for her that she could tolerate, but also that would help her keep her weight up. He was just incredibly supportive and doting. And yet at the same time, had his own great, highly successful career. And it was just, as I said, it was just so special to be able to watch those two interact.
I'm not sure if you've heard this story, but Dahlia Lithwick, whom we both know and is an amazing commentator on the Supreme Court. So if you've not checked out her work in Slate or her podcast Amicus, you should. But she did an oral history of the women who had gone to Harvard Law School at the same time as Marty and Justice Ginsburg. And she also talked about what it was like for those women when Justice Ginsburg was nominated to the Supreme Court in 1993. And she specifically mentions one woman who was also a high flyer in their class, very, very talented, went on to have a fairly good career, but had married a man who was a doctor and who was not quite as supportive as Marty Ginsburg had been of his own wife's ambitions. And this woman apparently was driving back from Nantucket or Cape Cod with her family and her husband at the helm when over public radio, it's announced that Ruth Bader Ginsburg has been nominated to the Supreme Court by President Clinton. And the daughter who's recounting this to Dahlia Lithwick says that her mother turns and looks at her father, the husband who's driving the car, and just shakes her head and then puts her face in her hands as if only I'd had a different husband, everything might have been different. But it was a great point. They had an unusual partnership at a time when marriages were much more traditional than certainly than theirs was, where like her career was as important as his. And her daughter Jane said, you know, daddy does the cooking and mommy does the thinking in our family. So anyway, what was the best advice that she gave you? I know that she had told people in the past that picking a spouse was among the most important decisions that one could make, but were there other nuggets that she passed on to you that you found useful in your own life and career?
So she didn't even have to say, pick a spouse that's going to be like Marty. I mean, you could just watch it in real time. And if you're semi-intelligent, figure out, I got to marry a guy like Marty. if I want to have, you know, a career, I need somebody like him who will support me. And so that definitely registered for me. She did give me a piece of advice once that I've liked to share. I corresponded with her. I wrote her a letter after I had my first child. And I was a professor, and I was about to go back into the classroom. And actually, on top of everything else, my first semester back, I was doing a visit back at Harvard, where I'd gone to school. And I was very nervous. How was I going to do this? Now this work-life balance suddenly is a totally different thing. It's far more consequential. There's this helpless life form that I have to think about at home. And so I wrote her and I said, I'm really nervous about all of this. I don't know how it's all going to go. And she wrote back a one-line email, which was a classic RBG, elegant, precise, and to the point. She said, where there's a will, there's a way. And I always held that, and to this day, hold that close to my heart, because I think that is basically the mantra that got her through every phase of her life, right? Where there's a will, there's a way. And she wanted to make a contribution. She wanted to do all these things. And she wanted also to have a full family life, and she did it all. And so that's an inspiration for me personally. I'm sure it is for a lot of other people as well. And I think back whenever I'm struggling, I think back to those words of wisdom she shared.
So did you know that Cornell has named a dormitory in her honor?
I did not know that. That's fantastic.
Well, so if we were to brainstorm how we could commemorate the life and legacy of this transformative and extraordinary person, what should we do to do this? She was the first American woman to lie in state in the Capitol after her death. But are there other places that you could imagine where we could see Ruth Bader Ginsburg and honor her memory in some sort of public, tangible way?
I haven't thought that much about that. I've thought more about how we can honor her with the work that we do.
Okay.
And I don't mean to dodge the question, but I do want to say that when we were working on the book, and I was working on the introduction, which she edited, I highlighted how she kept talking about the importance of the expansion of we the people and how we're supposed to build a more perfect union. That's the call, the aspiration that is in the preamble to the Constitution. And we had a very specific conversation about how to dedicate the book, what the book's dedication should be. And we dedicated it to our families and to all those who work to build a more perfect union. And that's what comes to mind when you ask me how to honor her, because I think at the end of her life, she was thinking about the people who would continue to do the work, continue to fight for the things that were so important to her and that were central to her legacy. And so when I think about how best to honor her, I think her wishes were that people would keep doing the work. But it is also a great question about how to honor her tangibly. We think about public monuments, and I think about like the US currency. Why isn't Harriet Tubman on a bill yet? The fight for that went ongoing, and there aren't enough women represented in these spaces. And so when we think about starting to have women's representation in these various spaces, Ruth Bader Ginsburg certainly should be on that list. There are a lot of other women who should be as well, but I hope that her name is among them.
So Marilyn has noted in the chat that Columbia Law School continues to be Columbia Law School, but could be named something else. So we will leave that out there for Columbia alumni to take up. When we think about Justice Ginsburg, lots of different things come to mind. Certainly her extraordinary work ethic, her defense of women's rights on the clerk, her advocacy for women as a litigator. But people don't know as much about her time as a law professor, or even this time she spent in academia and what that was like. So this might be an opportunity, I think, maybe to talk a little bit, not just about her career in the academy, but also her relationship with Herma. And someone has mentioned in the chat wanting to know a little bit more about Herma's book, Paving the Way. So if you would not mind saying a little more about that and their relationship, I'd be grateful.
I'd love to talk about Herma and the Justice. They met early in the 70s and began, or maybe it was late in the 60s, and they both had, they were pioneers as law professors. I mean, you and I go to faculty meetings and we look around the room and we see other women. They
Not
did
enough
not.
other women, not enough other women.
I completely agree, and certainly not enough women of color. There are a lot of ways in which we still have a long way to go. But they walked into a faculty meeting and they were the only woman, or in Herma's case, one of two. So that is hard for me to wrap my head around. What is really extraordinary about how their trajectories took off in analogous ways, then at Rutgers for Justice Ginsburg, at Berkeley for Herma, is that their female students started pushing them. We want a class on gender equality in the law. And that was a big impetus for both of them to then collaborate with a third co-author, Kenneth Davidson, to write the very first casebook on gender discrimination in the law, and then start teaching it as a class in the law schools. And it took off. And this also spearheaded the movement in terms of in the courts. The justice joins the ACLU. I'm sorry for the background noise from my dog. The justice joins the ACLU and the women's rights, founds the Women's Rights Project, and starts litigating these cases literally to change the content of this casebook as it's being written in the early 1970s. It publishes in 74, and just in the 2-3 years they were working on it, the whole law changed. So it's just really extraordinary. And looking back, 50 years into their friendship, Justice Ginsburg cited Herma as her dearest and favorite working colleague. And I think one of the reasons why that is because, and I saw this, I had dinner with the two of them a couple of times, and I just sat back and I listened. I didn't talk. I just listened to them reminisce and revel in each other's company. They lifted each other up. And so you have Herma testifying when Justice Ginsburg is nominated to the Supreme Court. And there's a great line in there I love. She says, in Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the president has nominated somebody worthy of the title. That's Herma lifting up the justice. And then you have the justice coming to Berkeley despite not being in good health. And she still was not in good health in the fall of 2019 because she had to honor Herma, her dear friend. It was so important to her to come and be with us and to honor her. And so I think that's a huge part of their relationship that I find very inspiring. It was women lifting up other women and celebrating other women. And in terms of Herma's book, it was so important to the justice to have it published because it chronicles woman by woman the stories of the first women to enter the legal academy, the very first. So, the women even well before Justice Ginsburg and Herma, who came to become law professors at a time when the legal profession writ large was not welcoming to women, never mind the academy. Now, Melissa, I want to put in a plug for Melissa because she wrote a magnificent addition to Herma's book, which I thought was really important that it be included, that highlights that Herma's methodology focused on accredited law schools. And so it missed out on some really extraordinary additional women of color who were at unaccredited law schools during this period, also paving the way. And with the addition of Melissa's contribution now, I think the book really gives a broad survey and window into what all of these women struggled with to try and open up doors so that Melissa and I could become law professors without nearly the same struggles. I mean, there's one story in there about a woman who was a law professor and wanted to adopt a child, and the state wouldn't let her adopt the child unless she wasn't working. And so she had to resign her professorship to adopt her child. And then happily, in her case, the faculty voted her back in to her position after the adoption went through. But I can't imagine having to go through some of the things these women went through. And I'm so grateful to them. And I'm so thrilled that Herma's book is published now and that we have these stories preserved.
Well, Amanda, this has been a fascinating conversation. I will just say that everything you say about Justice Ginsburg lifting up other women, I think we are truly the beneficiaries of that. I was mentored by Herma, you were mentored by Justice Ginsburg and Herma, and I think the reason why we're in the positions we are today is because we stand on the shoulders of these tremendous women. And I know that this is a difficult anniversary for you, given your closeness to the justice. So again, many condolences to you as you consider her loss, and to all of us as we think about what her passing means for the country. And we think about how to renew our commitment to living her legacy every day. I want to thank Liz and Jennifer and the rest of the great folks at the National Women's History Museum for hosting this. It's been an absolute pleasure to be in conversation with you, Amanda, and I will turn it over to Liz. Thank you.
Thank you. If I can just chime in and say thank you, Melissa. It's been just a privilege to be in conversation with you, and thank you to the museum for hosting us. And thank you to everyone for joining us.
And thank you to Amanda for sharing the insight into Justice Ginsburg and her life and legacy, and to Melissa for so beautifully moderating this discussion and conversation. What a wonderful way to spend time on a Sunday. I could listen to you both speak forever. Thank you to everyone who has attended today and for your questions. We apologize that we could not get through all of them. You guys were absolutely wonderful. I just want to remind all of our attendees that this program today is being recorded. It will be available on our website later this week. I've put that link into the chat box for you. Keep checking. It should be up hopefully by Wednesday. If you enjoyed today's program, please join us next Sunday, September 26th at 6 p.m. Eastern, where we will present the third of a 4-part virtual panel discussion series, The Missing Waves of Feminism. Our distinguished panel for the discussion will re-examine the origins, context, and voices of the so-called third wave of feminism. On Sunday, October 24th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, we will welcome award-winning historian and New York Times bestselling author Keisha N. Blaine for a conversation about her book, Until I Am Free. Until I Am Free, Blaine situates Fannie Lou Hamer as a key political thinker alongside leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, and demonstrates how her ideas remain salient for a new generation of activists. We also have 3 upcoming Brave Girls virtual storytime programs, Friday, October 1st, Wednesday, October 6th, and Wednesday, October 20th, all at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. Again, I've put all of those links into the chat for you if you're interested in registering for those programs. All events are free, but advanced registration is required. Thank you again to everybody who came in and were so engaged during today's conversation. Thank you to Amanda and Melissa for such an enlightening and engaging afternoon. We thank you. We hope to see you all very soon. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday.